All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Safety Connection. Um, we are talking using consensus in safety decision making today. I'm Tova Larson, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. Before we get started with some quick webinar housekeeping, I'll tell you a little bit more about me and my background. I am a health and safety consultant based out of Ottawa, as I mentioned. I've been in the health and safety field now for almost 20 years, and in that time, I've worked in the federally regulated sector, I've worked in the provincially regulated sectors, I've worked in the public sector, I've worked in the private sector, and I have spent a large amount of that time working with committees, although this is not a committee-specific session, just to be very clear. What's also fascinating is the process that we're going to discuss is one that you can use outside of work as well. So for those of you with families, this can be a really fantastic tool that you can use with your kids and teens too. Very wide variety of topics. I did not start my career as a health and safety professional. I started my career as a laboratory chemist. How did I get into health and safety? I got hurt at work, and I learned three big things in the year that I was hurt. The first thing I learned was that being in pain all the time turned me into a jerk. The second thing I learned was that I had no patience for other people when I was hurt. I learned that there's nothing good to watch on TV between the hours of 9 and 5 if you have basic cable and it's like 2005 and there's no Netflix. And I also learned that when some people get hurt, they get really, really angry. And I was one of those people. So I knew my injury could have been prevented for $30, which is approximately the amount that it costs for two people to get a decent meal at McDonald's. And I thought to myself, was $30 really worth a year of my life? Mind blown. So that made me understandably upset. So instead of letting that anger destroy me, I decided to turn it into passion for my health and safety career. And that's when I went into safety. So that's a little bit about me. When I'm not working, I am a ski patroller at a local ski hill. So if you come ski in the beautiful Gatineau Hills in Camp Fortune and you get hurt, you might see me. All right, we're going to move on and talk a little bit more. If you are just joining us, if you have just hopped on, it is 10:33. We are collecting some short demographic information on behalf of the MLITSD, just to get a picture of who's using the services of the Safety Association. And this is not no personal information is collected, and just a heads up that that's there. The function number is also in the chat. If you scroll up in the chat, you'll be able to see the link to this. You'll also be able to see the function number, which is 227187. So let's go ahead and move forward and talk a little bit more about our webinar housekeeping here. Audio comes through your computer. Headphones are recommended. Phone conference is, of course, available. Your camera is going to remain off. Your mic is muted, and we're going to be using the chat to communicate with each other. And do be mindful that messages can be seen by all participants. I will be sharing my email at the end, so if you have questions or you'd like to connect to discuss really any health and safety topic that might be on your mind, you are, of course, welcome to reach out to me. Calls are free, emails are always free. So we're Safety Association, that's what we're here for. So let's move forward and let's talk a little bit about some of our engagement features here in Teams. We have reactions. So if I say something really funny, you can actually go and just click the laughing react. There's the floating heart. They float up on the screen. There's the which is one of my favorites, and you might be tempted to use that one a little bit today, given what we're talking about. There's definitely some surprises here in the program. There are also polls. They appear in the chat and or on your screen. Once you have gone and answered one, you can just click the X if it's covering your screen, or just move on in the chat. The chat itself, you can type messages at any time. To access the chat, you click the speech bubble. It might be in your ribbon. It may also be up at the top. And you click on the speech bubble that says chat. It opens up a little kind of mini window on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a box at the bottom that says type a message, and you type a message, and then you hit enter, then everyone can see it. And that's how you're going to be able to ask questions. It's how you're going to be able to share your experiences, maybe with consensus. And we have some interaction where I'm going to be asking you some questions about what you think we should do next in our consensus process. We also have some accessibility features to turn on live captions. We can hit the three dots. That is the more, otherwise known as the meatball menu, meatball, meatball, meatball. And you can click on language and speech. From there, you can turn on live captioning. It is reasonably accurate. I do try to speak slowly enough, but if you find that I'm speaking too quickly, this can also really help. Or you can just be like, hey, can you slow down? And I'm happy to try to do that too. Full screen. If you want the print to be bigger, you lose my camera obviously in your chat, but it makes the presentation full screen. To get into that, you click view and you select the full screen option. To get out of this, you just hit escape. So what is a safety connection? A safety connection is, well, you're in a safety connection right now. A safety connection, I like to say, is the best unsung hero of WSPS. They are sessions that have a number of main goals. One is to learn about health and safety industry topics in a fun and engaging way. It's really about learning, sharing, discovering what's of value to you. I'm going to ask you some opportunities to be able to share your own experiences with consensus through the session here today, and including your challenges with consensus. And I would also, when we think about learning, sharing, discovering what's of value to you, I may hit on an idea and you go, wow, that's a great idea. I like to call that a negative gold. You can go pick up that negative gold and take it with you. But I might also be talking about something, you go, you know what? I'm not sure that's super relevant to my organization specifically. And that's fair, right? Like the nuggets of gold in this session are going to be different for each of you. So it's really about picking out what is of value to you. This is also a great opportunity for you to connect virtually with industry peers while learning about best practices and sharing your own experiences. And you're obviously attending from your own personal workspace, which originally started during the pandemic for COVID reasons, but it turns out it's really amazing because it allows people to join from all across Ontario, all across Canada, and in some cases, all over the world. So my very first question to you, and we're going to answer this in the chat, is what do you think a consensus is? What do you think a consensus is? What do you think it means to reach a consensus? Mutual agreement. So everybody is in agreement. Sort of that unanimous, everybody is on the same page. Everyone is at least agreeing to try it. Oh, that's interesting. I like that. All in agreement. So we're thinking again, unanimity, agreement by all parties. A majority of the group is agreeing to a majority. So we've got unanimity, majority rules. Everyone is at least on the same page. See if anyone else is chiming in on this one. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And when we see the responses coming, you'll notice that these aren't actually the same. Unanimity is not the same as majority rule. Getting agreement by all parties often is, depending on the level of agreement of all of the parties, may or may not, in fact, be consensus-based decision making. I really love the everyone is agreeing to at least try it. That's I love that. I'm going to be stealing that, Claude. It's a plan to at least move forward. Oh, I like that. Interesting. So let's talk about what a consensus is. A consensus comes from the Latin word consentire, which means to feel together, to agree, and to be in harmony with each other. Um, so when we're looking to build a consensus, our goal is to seek a path forward. As Fabio points out, it's about determining a path forward that all the participants can live with. Does this mean everyone has to be like two thumbs up? No, they don't. But they all need to at least be, as Claude says, be willing to try it. Um, Consensus also does not, in fact, require unanimous viewpoints. It considers a wide variety of perspectives. What's also interesting about consensus in particular is that it protects minority needs. We know that not everyone has the same needs, the same concerns, the same challenges. And so we need to ensure that those who may be minorities in the decision in the bigger, wider group, that their needs are still being considered. It also values all contributions equally. When we think about majority rule, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, that invalidates in many ways the contributions of those who are opposed. What's also interesting about what is a consensus is the decision making stages and process. Oftentimes when we get into things like majority rule or unanimity, we go through the process of determining a path forward, and then we only involve our various affected parties at the end. We say, well, these are all the ideas we came up with. What do you think? And that's, in fact, not consensus building either. It's about building the consensus. That's part of the process. It's not just the test for consensus that makes a consensus, it's actually the pathway. I like to say that consensus is both a journey and a destination. Often, where we forget the big consensus piece is we have the journey on our own and then we ask for the consensus at the end, when really we should be starting the journey together. It's also inclusive and it's collaborative. So rather than having one individual work through the process, everyone is working through the process. All right. So, knowing that, let's talk a little bit now about what isn't consensus. Unanimity is also not consensus because it doesn't give space for nuance or differing opinions. It doesn't allow space for abstention. There are some situations where someone may want to abstain from being part of a decision making process for some very legitimate reasons. And we'll talk about what some of those might be as we move through the process. It doesn't really leave the opportunity to stand aside. Unanimity also doesn't really leave a lot of space for people to express reservations because there's a lot of social pressure if a decision is being based on unanimity to toe the party line, which is a great segue into majority rule. And these two things can sometimes have elements of coexistence, where with majority rule, this is the option where if you have 50% plus one support, the decision is final. We have winners and losers. There are the people that lose who disagreed. We have the people that won who agreed that they say this is what our path forward is going to be. It's all or nothing also in majority rule. And one of the biggest challenges is majority rule also only factors in the people that showed up. So you may, in fact, have a majority that doesn't agree, but the majority who showed up agreed. So that's the path that you take. It doesn't lead to great outcomes. It also doesn't protect minority needs. When we think about the winners and losers, if you have, I'm going to use the example, and it's a safety example. Let's say that your organization is looking at getting new uniforms, and only 5% of your staff are female. When I was working with one of Ontario's utilities. It was like a local utility. Only 1% of their staff, their outside staff, of their line staff, of their technical staff were women. So if you're looking to make decisions about uniforms and you go, well, we're going to go with majority rule, there's no way that the needs of those women, whose bodies are shaped very differently than a man, are even going to likely make the conversation. Because if you're just voting by minority rule, by majority rule, the overwhelming majority are going to have different needs than the minority. My apologies. What's interesting about majority rule and unanimity is that you can have situations where, in the interest of having unanimity, you have people with reservations or who flat out don't support this particular path forward, keeping those reservations to themselves to maintain that unanimity to move forward as a group, which is also a negative outcome, because it's in those reservations that the real work of getting to solutions with optimal outcomes is actually found. Other types of decision making that's not consensus either is delegation. That's leaving the group to discuss, and then the final decision is handed off to an individual chosen by the group. It is a decision making process. Consensus is not the only one, but this often leaves the final decision in the hands of one individual rather than as a group decision, leaving everyone else to live with whatever that person chose. Dictator rule is different than delegation. Delegation is the formal decision to hand the decision off to a selected individual. Dictator rule is different, and this can be either formal or de facto out of fear. One of the wasn't a joint health and safety committee, it was a federal committee, but a workplace health and safety committee that I encountered earlier in my career was in fact run by dictator rule. The management co-chair would become violently angry and upset anytime someone said something around the table that he disagreed with. And so the group was making decisions out of fear. With dictator rule, you can have a dictator who is in a position of formal power, someone who is in, for instance, senior leadership, to which the entire group turns when a decision is being made. That would be an example of dictator rule, but in more of a formal context versus the de facto fear-based model of dictator rule. What's challenging with dictator rule is it, again, shuts down dissent, and dissent is really where the opportunities for improvement can be found. But it also creates situations where not only are minority needs in no way going to be considered, but very similar to delegation, whatever that one dictator person thinks is probably the direction the rest of the group is going to go, whether or not it's even good for the group. When I was discussing this session with my dad, who used to work in aviation research, one of the fascinating things he said to me was that in his workplace, there was such a heavy dictator rule concept. And it was, there was a combination of formal and de facto, that his organization, that, you're sitting in a meeting, the majority of the staff are looking around going, I don't think this is a very good idea, but no one had the courage to be able to stand up to the dictator to say, look, I think we're about to spend $5 million and I think this is a really bad idea. And you know what? It was, in fact, a really bad idea. It didn't get them anywhere. And now we have a giant bag of money that was effectively just wasted. They could have been prevented, but there wasn't enough safety in being able to say no. There's compromise. Compromise means that both sides are giving something up and you meet somewhere in the middle. And you might think compromise is also consensus, but it's not, because it takes those proposals and it weakens both of them. It can lead to disjointed outcomes where you have two different outcomes that really don't have a lot to do with each other. It can also lead to really confusing implementation. And in the end, often coming to a compromise is based on, both people, rather than thinking about getting what you want. Most of the time, compromise turns into simply saying, well, I don't want that person to win. So it's about ensuring that the other person is losing something rather than a gain. Loss versus gain. When we look at consensus building, I like to think about it as more of a yes and mentality rather than a no, because if we do that, then that person is gonna be the happy person, and I want to make sure everyone is equally unhappy. Then we have plurality, which is also fascinating. This is voting, but without a 50% threshold. And it does achieve as much agreement as possible in a short period of time. But it's best used for low stakes, reversible short term decisions. Now, what's also interesting about consensus is that there are pros and cons even to consensus building. This is not the only decision making model. And we are going to talk about times when using consensus makes sense and some times when you absolutely should not use consensus. So some of the pros around consensus involve better decision making. We often end up with more fulsome, more well-considered options. We ensure that those minority needs have their needs met. And one of the goals we're going to be focusing as we go through the consensus process on needs and wants. And one of the goals of a strong consensus is ensuring that everyone's needs are met. Majority rule does not ensure that. And in fact, many of the other decision-making processes that we just discussed do not, in fact, ensure that the needs of everyone are met. Consensus also doesn't create winners and losers the way majority rule does. And I want you to think we're going to be talking through the entire session, and while it's not specifically safety related, about a town with too many bananas. Okay, so this is in fact, we're going to go with apples. It's going to be an apple town with too many apples. So we have Apple Valley. Apple Valley is a town that is absolutely filled with apple trees. And these apples are creating problems. So there's so many of them that their town during apple season, which is right now, which is a beautiful analogy, smells like rotting, stinky fruit. People are slipping on apples. Apples were falling from trees and hitting people on the head. It's not a great scene, but it's also attracting wildlife. And those wildlife are legitimately frightening. They're getting bears, they're getting fishers, they're getting anything that will eat an apple is going to come into town. And the bears in particular are becoming extremely bothersome. Also dangerous for the bears. And they're a wildlife protection community. So we have Apple Valley here. Now, what does the town council decide to do? The town council they're given three options. That the planners do their thing in the municipality and they say we can cut down all the apple trees, every apple tree in town. That way we're going right up to we're thinking hierarchy of controls. We're going right up to the source. Cut down all the apple trees. They say we can pick up the apples and send them all to the town compost facility, but it's almost at capacity. Or we can force everyone to eat 10 pounds of apples. Town law, you have to eat 10 pounds of apples. We're watching, eat it or else. And cutting down the apple trees sounds like around the town council, it seems like a really bad idea. because when Apple Valley was founded, they planted tons of apple trees. This was hundreds of years ago because it didn't have a lot of tree cover. And they thought trees, shade, food, everyone wins, apples, great idea. But now they have way too many of them. And so they go, okay, well, we don't want to completely defoliate our entire town. So that's not on. Also, some of the apples, the trees are on private property, not on city property. So they say, well, what about the town compost facility? And I go, this is getting expensive. We're going to have to increase the capacity. It's going to involve a big capital investment. We don't really have the money for that. Like it's a once in a generation kind of thing. Apples are not really, I mean, maybe we can incinerate apples, but that's also, we don't have an incinerator. That going the waste management route also sounds expensive, and they just see dollar signs. And so what are they left with? They're picking from a slate of relatively unappealing options. And so they create a law that forces everyone to eat 10 pounds of apples. Who loses in this? You tell me in the chat. Who do you think loses in Apple Valley? Someone have told you you have to eat 10 pounds of apples by law. Everybody loses. Yeah, some people hate apples. Some people are allergic to apples. Other people don't know what the heck to do with an apple. They don't know how to cook it. They don't know how to prepare it. They can't think of, they're just like, so I have to sit and eat this entire bag of apples because we have an apple problem? Absurd. But this is something that can really happen. Maybe not to that level of absurdity, but when we talk about in safety decision making, often we are stuck with a slate of less than ideal options. You look at the guarding, and the guarding is going to be expensive. And you look at you say, okay, well, the guarding's expensive. Replacing the equipment sounds even more expensive. So what do you end up doing? Putting a sign on it and telling people not to stick their fingers in there. Unfortunately, it's not a very effective solution, and there are better ways. So when we look at the pros and cons, what's also fascinating is that some of those other decision-making models actually tend to result in really poor decisions. And forcing everyone to eat 10 pounds of apples seems like a really bad decision overall. What's neat about consensus is that it also maintains good relationships. When we look at majority rule, it definitely creates winners and losers, and we're seeing that play out in real time. Our level of political rhetoric, both in this country and our country to the south, has become more polarized. In some cases, it has become concerningly violent, as we are not doing a good job of reaching across the aisle and building cross-functional relationships. And in the case of our political parties, that involves bipartisan work. It is, for the record, for this recording, October 28th, 2024, and we are only days away from the American US election. So yeah, we see that when it comes to relationship building, building relationships across aisles can be incredibly important. What's interesting about consensus is it also supports the effective implementation of any pathway forward, because you're identifying through the process. You're identifying those with the strongest support. You're identifying those with technical knowledge and skills through the process, rather than making a decision and then trying to figure out who can help you later. And it often results in creative, well-rounded solutions that you never would have thought of otherwise. There are cons, though. It's time consuming. And I am not going to sugarcoat it. That is absolutely the case. It can be inefficient. For some things, it's not ideal, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And we can also end up with groupthink, where group members may feel pressure to consent to a path forward, even though they disagree. And groupthink, where we start to just sort of like bob our heads, can stifle disagreement. So we'll talk a little bit about ways that groups can create safe spaces for disagreement to maximize the benefits they're getting out of the time investment out of a consensus process. And it is an investment. I want you to thinking, you're like, oh, this is going to take way too long. And you think, well, think about the time as an investment in getting it right the first time, and an investment in everyone involved, because the relationship building that underpins the system also has inherent value in and of itself. So some of the factors we want to consider in determining what of our many decision models, and we've talked about several, are right for us, include your group size. If you're dealing with smaller groups, there's kind of a golden size of a group to make a decision. And if you're getting, into groups that are over 20, certainly over 20, but when we look at a consensus, I like to say that, a working group, really, I would ideally say not more than 16 and preferably not more than 12. As you get into large groups, it becomes more difficult, more time consuming to be able to have everyone involved. And consensus does, in fact, involve everyone being a part of the process. We also have the diversity of the group. If you have a very homogeneous group, a consensus building model may not, in fact, be of as much value, because your decision is, or, if you go through the process, it's very likely to be quite quick because you're all likely thinking similar ideas. When we look at diversity of the group, though, if you have a very diverse group, it is even more important that you consider consensus, because you have a higher probability of having minority needs involved, whether you know it or not. There's the level of urgency of the decision. If something is extremely urgent, such as in an emergency, this is not the right choice for you because of the time investment involved. There's the level of importance of the decision, and the higher the importance of the decision, the more important it is to consider consensus to ensure that all of those various needs are in fact considered. There's the values of the working group themselves. We'll talk a little bit about organizational culture on the next slide, but there are some groups that lend themselves to consensus more than others. In organizations that have a high degree of social orientation, they are often more likely to engage in consensus processes. A great example when I think about consensus may be, for instance, a diversity or pride board, where they really want to ensure that all of those various minority needs are in fact considered. There's also the values of the organization. This can be used by any organization, but whether you are for-profit, and this includes whether you're for-profit or not for-profit, or whether you are in a governmental space. But when we look at the values of the organization, if the organization is humanitarian in nature, is very focused on social inclusion, they're a lot more likely to use the consensus model, maybe than an organization that is not. There's also the willingness of members of the group to participate in the process. There's cohesiveness of the group. If the group is incredibly fractious, it can be very difficult to come to a consensus moving forward. There's also individual member receptiveness to alternative viewpoints. Not everyone is particularly receptive to the views of others. And the more individuals you have around the group who are more open to plural or alternative views, the more effective your process is likely to be. If you have that, for instance, that individual who was railroading everyone at that Workplace Health and Safety Committee meeting, the likelihood of consensus decision making, which it was in fact a federally regulated workplace, which enshrines consensus building in the Canada Labour Code Part 2 and associated committee related regulations. Unfortunately, the consensus process in that particular committee was not particularly effective because that individual was in no way receptive to alternative viewpoints. And the level of facilitator skill and impartiality can also impact whether or not this is a choice that you make. There's also the level of information available about a problem. And the level of information, if you don't have enough information, you may need to get more information before you move forward. So when do we want to consider a consensus and when do we not consider consensus? So when should we consider using it? When you have complex problems. I know you might want to say, but if it's a complex problem and it's really big, that's going to make the consensus really hard, but that's actually when you need it the most. When there are many affected parties and perspectives, when you have more time available, when minority groups have unique or different needs. When we think about Apple Valley, there are people that are allergic to apples and they have a very different need than the people that aren't. When you have an open-minded group, a group that's interested in managing change, when we think about managing change, being sure that you have as many viewpoints represented in the decision making around the change can actually help your group mitigate any negative repercussions or negative attitudes or beliefs about that change. If we have a cooperative or collectivist culture, now, when we think about cultures, this may be particular religious groups. The Quakers are well known as having a highly collectivist culture. There are also different regions of the world that have more collectivist versus individualistic focuses. And those groups tend more toward consensus building as a natural course of their decision making than perhaps in more of an individualistic society. And we have the organization that values relationships. Because consensus building builds relationships rather than tearing those relationships apart, creating factioning, this can be a valuable exercise where you are in an organization that prioritizes the health and strength of relationship building. But when should we not use consensus? When you don't have enough information to make a decision, you need to get more information before moving forward. During emergencies, you don't have time to make a consensus work. You may not be able to gather all of your various affected parties as a result of the emergency. Emergency management works best where you have a clear chain of command and where you have decisive, sensible, and often predetermined decision making. You say, if this happens, this is what our process is. And then you have an incident commander that allows that to happen. During emergencies, you're also often having to triage. And anytime you're triaging, you may be having to make decisions that are very, very quick. When the issue is trivial or the solution is prescribed by legislation or standards, if you are talking about that machine that we just discussed, maybe consensus, rather than going to a consensus within your organization, you go instead to a consensus-based standard, such as the CSA standard on machine safeguarding, and instead use that to drive your decision making rather than trying to reinvent the wheel yourselves. Or in this case, reinvent the guard. If something is already legislated, you need to ensure that whatever decision you come forward with, and there may be elements of consensus involved in the decision making, but you need to make sure that whatever you move forward with, in fact, does meet those legislated requirements. Other times where I see, consensus not working well are when all of the decisions are absolutely awful. We think about the classic example, I'm sure you've all seen it, of like we've got the trolley that is, you can where you've got like multiple people versus one person. It's called like the trolley dilemma, where you are either, where like that involves like, people dying, and like that's where both of the choices are absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. That's not a time for consensus building. There's also organizations that will go through all of these nice processes and they'll consult with all of their various affected parties. And then they're just going to do whatever they'd already decided that they were going to do anyway, because actually this was all just an illusion. That is the fastest way I can think of to fundamentally lose trust from absolutely everyone in your organization. If you're doing this just to create an illusion of choice, when in fact you have already made a determination as an organization for a path forward, do not even bother. Because what's going to happen is you're going to get all of these people building the consensus. And then in the back end, they're going to go, but we built you a really good idea. They go, yeah, we're just going to do this anyway. They're never going to want to build a consensus again with you. And they're likely going to be very, very upset. It's disaffecting. It's disingenuous. Don't do it. Another is when the actual objective is unclear. With Apple Valley, their goal is to stop people from slipping, tripping, and falling on apples and to keep the animals out of the town. That is pretty clear what their goal is. How they're going to get there, we will talk about. But if you have no idea what a good outcome even looks like or what your goal is, it's really hard to be able to determine what a proper path forward is going to be. And last is in highly competitive or individualistic organizational cultures. If you are in an absolutely cutthroat industry or an absolutely cutthroat organization where it's like every person for themselves and, put on your own oxygen mask and kind of screw everyone else, this is not going to work for you because it really just becomes a bit of a shark tank. So if that is what the culture in your organization is, maybe don't get them all in a room to fight each other. So let's talk a little bit more about how to actually build a consensus. Before we move on, though, I would love to know from you, knowing all of what we know about consensus as a concept, when are you planning on using this? And I would also love to know at least one key takeaway from what we learned about consensus, just even as a concept before we move into how to do it. What is one takeaway from what you just learned about consensus decision making? When to use it, when not to use it, pros and cons, what it is. Did anyone have any surprises in what we just discussed? Feel free to drop those into the chat. All right, let's move forward to talk a little bit about how to actually build the consensus. So the first step in setting your team up for success starts with team communication and ground rules and creating psychological safety. In order for a consensus to work, there is a certain amount of vulnerability involved in being able to say, you know what? I have concerns about what's going on. That's a good one, Reagan. Yeah, that competitive atmospheres can contraindicate consensus-based decisions. In fishbone meetings, this would work well. Yeah. And we're going to talk about the fishbone in a few minutes when we talk about gathering information in order to make decisions. All right, so when we think about creating a psychological safety, one of the first things that we need to do as a group is commit to consensus as a concept. Um, in terms of making decisions, we talked a little bit about pros, cons, reasons why you might choose particular decision-making processes. And by the way, it's when we talk about majority rule, and I'm kind of like slagging on that, there are times when majority rule is the only practical option. I think about in our public elections here in the province of Ontario and in Canada, you just cannot build a consensus with, millions of people. Getting people to ballot boxes it's the easiest of the options available. And then when organizations, especially governments, are making decisions about particular topics, and right now a hot topic in Ontario are bike lanes, often they have a consultation process where interested members of the public can provide more input. And they do right now. So if you like bike lanes, feel free to go and head onto the Ontario website and do that. Or if you hate bike lanes, up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to think or do. Leave your pride out of the consensus meeting. Ooh, it's so true. And we're going to talk about that. Diversity of a team really needs to be taken into consideration. Yeah. And one of the other considerations around diversity is looking at who's around the table and who's not. Are you missing critical people that have potential for impact? If a group of people are not represented, but they are impacted, that's one of the things that we want to identify as part of our process. We want as an organization to commit to an active listening rule. That means that we're not here with our devices, just kind of listening away, but not really paying attention to anything anybody is saying. This also is true for laptops. Put the laptop down. Focus on remaining constructive and collaborative, where we are focusing on collaborating for an optimal outcome, and the concept of, rather than tearing an idea down, really putting forward a constructive solution to a gap or issue that you might see with a particular problem or with a particular solution. If someone says, okay, well, this is the solution that I think we should do, and you say, okay, what if we thought about it like this? Rather than going, that's a terrible idea. Very different conversation, right? We want to set aside titles and power dynamics to come around, and us versus them mentalities. When I think about a JHSC, there's management versus worker, and we want to set those titles aside and join what I consider to be a round table concept. Everyone at the table is equal, and everyone around the table can champion the needs of anyone around the table. Championing the concept of minority needs is really important in building that decision. We need to commit to ensuring that the needs of the most vulnerable are, in fact, going to be met. We want to encourage courageous criticism. Courageous criticism is that person in the room where everyone else is going, I think this is a great idea, to say, I have that concern. I know it's really hard sometimes to be that person to say that. And we want to thank and appreciate those who are sticking their hand up, and that they will not only feel psychologically safe to be able to do that, but that they know that is encouraged, because that is in fact part of the process. We want to create safe space for everyone to bring their whole selves to the table. I am not just a health and safety professional. I'm a ski patroller. I'm a cat mom. I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I'm a person who lives with a mental health condition. I am, I'm a woman. There are a lot of different aspects of me, not just at work, but outside of work, that also not only influence my decision making, but can also in some ways make me more sensitive to the needs of other particular groups. And we want to ensure that people are able to bring their whole lived experiences to the table, because it's in those conversations that we ensure that wide variety of viewpoints. Along with that idea of leaving our titles and power dynamics at the door, along with our ego, we also want to ensure anyone can call for a break. Consensus building can be a psychologically demanding exercise. So if people need a break, either to collect their thoughts, to go get a drink of water, for a bio break, we want to ensure that anyone can in fact say, I need a minute. But also, we want them to be able to feel psychologically safe, to be able to know that they can ensure their own needs are being met through the process. And we want to ensure confidentiality and United Front rules. What happens around that table, what happens in Vegas, stays in Vegas. And thank goodness for that. But that means that the dissent, the concerns, the ideas that are generated through the consensus process stay at the table. Once the group has made the decision, once they have reached a consensus on a path forward, that they're all going to commit to moving forward as a united front, leave the discussions behind because the decision is made. And that rather than undermining the value of the consensus by, bad-mouthing the decision later, our goal is to ensure that everyone's needs are met, maybe not all their preferences, but certainly their needs, so that everyone can at least live with the outcome. And while we may not always get all of what we want, with the United Front rule, this allows us to be able to commit as a group to move forward and say the discussions and dissension, and maybe I didn't get all of my needs met, we're going to leave that at the table. Or we did get all our needs met. I did get all my preferences met, rather. We're going to leave that at the table, and we're going to move forward as a group rather than trying to relitigate the consensus process over and over and over through the implementation process. Yeah, other great notes in the chat. With setting aside Thompson power dynamics feels like something that those with power really control. Any advice on this? Ultimately, I think setting aside those power dynamics starts with having a facilitator who is not in a formal position of power. Your facilitator, by the way, does not, for a consensus process, does not, in fact, they're not, in fact, your decision maker, but they're the one who's just helping manage the conversation. I think it really helps to have someone who doesn't have a formal position of power because it sets that kind of equality for all. If you have those in positions of power who are ultimately going to override the decision or veto the decision of the group, maybe this is not something that you want a consensus on. Now, pro and con, when we think about committees and they write a recommendation, yes, the employer can choose to implement or not implement. I still do believe that joint health and safety committees, workplace health and safety committees, and policy committees really should be using a consensus-based model. Partly because I think that when you include those decision makers, those people in positions of formal power in the conversation, but in a more equal way, they're more likely to agree with, they're more likely, if they've been a part of this consensus process, all of their needs have been met, right? When we think about needs versus wants, if we ensure that they're at the table and all of their needs have been met, they're a lot more likely to want to implement that consensus in the end. But their facilitator needs to be strong enough, and the group needs to create enough psychological safety for all of the other group members to get their needs met, so it doesn't become a de facto rule situation. And if you have someone like that committee co-chair management co-chair that I was talking about who cannot be a part of a consensus process, then maybe the rest of the group moves forward without them and they submit the recommendation directly to the employer. In the case that I was describing, they in fact brought their concerns to upper management based on workplace violence concerns around a committee table. And that person is no longer employed with that organization, partly as a result. Not entirely, but partly. All right, so let's move forward and talk a little bit now about how to actually build the consensus. The first step is to introduce the issue. We want to get all related problems on the table. And we share background information. In the case of Apple Valley, understanding why we have so many apple trees, that the place was rather deforested. And so the town had planted these apples to be a source of food, but also to create shade, really informs a little bit about why we are where we are. The town of Apple Valley also for years gave anybody who wanted an apple tree on their property a free apple tree. So this explains why we have so many apple trees and not a lot of other trees. You're like, okay, I can kind of see how we got to be Apple Valley. Now, we also want to establish our common goals, and these are big picture goals. In the world of health and safety, it could be reducing risk or improving compliance. It could be strengthening your internal responsibility system, but ultimately we're looking at the big picture goal, and then the details of how we get there, that's going to be through the process. Understand that complex issues may in fact require multiple consensus processes to finalize each component separately. So while we will talk about the test for consensus a little bit later, that test, you may have to do it multiple times, not least of which multiple times over the final end result, but looking at each of the items kind of as almost like a fishbone. We also want to establish our decision scope. But one interesting thing about consensus building is that while I am showing it as a linear process, it in fact is a semi-non-linear process. While we do have a linearity to it, we can move amongst the stages at any time. So there is a randomness to it. You may determine what's in scope, what's out of scope, but then through some of the exploration of the issue may determine that there are additional items that you want to take out of scope. So we're coming back to introducing and setting up for the discussion. But you may also identify items that you determined were out of scope originally that critically need to be included in the scope. Right now, I'm in the middle of a process at home, even in making a decision about what new water heater to buy. And, you know, you might think that having a conversation about a range hood actually is out of scope, but it turns out that it is in scope, because if I get a range hood that has too much juice, too much sucking power, it can actually backdraft the chimney of my water heater. So that is part of my consideration in determining what next water heater I'm going to buy before I go and buy a really, really powerful range hood, because I love to cook. So you may look and say, these things are not related, Tova, but they kind of actually are. And that can also happen in your workplace. You may also be struggling with a control you already have for a safety element that's created unintended consequences, in which case you would want to discuss both elements of this, both the original hazard and the consequences, and then how we're going to address both so that you can put optimal safety in place. Introducing the issue ultimately is about ensuring that everyone around the table, and I'm going to pop back quickly, it's really about understanding why that everyone, wow, I am, okay. I mean, she's getting my slide to move backward. When we look at introducing the issue, we want to ensure that everyone around the table is starting with a base of information so that they're able to understand the problem and why it's happening, which is a great segue into the fishbone diagram. This is the contributing factors finding model that so many organizations use. You may have your own, but when we think about related problems, we want to figure out why people are making the choices they make. When we look at things that people do or don't do, the actions they take, the decisions they make, no one makes the decision in a vacuum. Here at WSPS, we had a number of back injuries reported to us, and they said, people aren't using the cart. And I said, yeah, but I go to places with stairs and snowy parking lots. And I go, okay. All right, well, that makes some sense, right? We want to factor in equipment that may or may not be available. We want to factor in materials, any material factors, heavy, toxic, awkward, bulky, too much, too little, too hot, too cold, not available, in the wrong spot. Environmental factors. In the case of Apple Valley, one of the fascinating things about Apple Valley is that it's a place where that's really ideal for growing apple trees, but there are other types of trees that maybe would not, in fact, be well suited to that particular area. And different varieties of apples grow better in different areas. So even the apples that you see are particular varieties that grow well in Apple Valley and maybe don't grow elsewhere. There are processes as well. When I think the difference, by the way, between people decisions and process decisions, people decisions are actions or decisions individuals make. Process are decisions organizations make. Like how heavy a box can be, or what your shift schedules are going to be, or what your rest periods might be. When I look at process factors in discussion around consensus, often this is where the bulk of this discussion is. And it is where some of the most resistance from organizations overall can sometimes be. They're really reluctant to change their processes, even when their processes are not working well for them. So before we launch into problem solving mode, stop. We are so tempted, by the way. You're like, okay, I see we have a problem. We need to do this, 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 and this. No, you don't. That's not the next step in the process. The next step in the process is actually figuring out what's important to your various affected parties. All of those, we have to identify those that are affected. And look around the table. Are there groups that are missing? People share their thoughts and feelings, their concerns, their needs. Needs are critically important. We absolutely need to know what the core needs are of the group. For me, I'm 5'2". One of the things I absolutely need as a core need when choosing personal protective equipment, I need it to fit me. And there is, no amount of that's just how things are going to be. This is just what we have that's going to fix the fact that I am 5'2". There's nothing wrong with being 5'2", or being a smaller stature person or a larger stature person. It just kind of is. But if you're not considering those needs, or you say, well, but the majority of people don't need their pants hemmed on their uniform, but I do. And if I don't, it's a trip risk for me. We also want to explore the history of the issue. This is where having a mix of people that are new to the issue and have experience with the issue can be really valuable. You've got people who have the backstory, and with the PEMAP that we just talked about, understanding the factors underlying even where we're at and finding all of the related problems, really valuable. But also having some new voices around the table can help bring creativity and can help bring new viewpoints. And we need a little bit of both. We also, in exploring the issue, want to identify any legislation that may, in fact, apply and identify where we might need more information. When we think about the legislation, codes, and standards, what of these need to be consulted? Have we consulted them? Do we even know what's legislatively required? Because that's going to be a baseline that's going to set the rest of the decision making into practice. Through the exploration of these needs, the wants, the concerns, the opinions, solutions may start to peek through. One says, well, I have all of these concerns, but this would solve these concerns. You go, okay, I'm glad you're thinking ideas. We're going to park that, because right now we're just trying to explore what's important to everyone. And what's important to different individuals is, in fact, going to differ. In Apple Valley, one of the things that was really important to the town was that whatever they do, it had to be revenue neutral, because they don't have any additional money and the town is suffering financially. they looked around a group. They got a group of citizens. They had people that were allergic to apples. They had people that were, people that were business people. They had scientists. They had a bunch of different voices around the table. They had youth at the table. And one of the things that they identified was that through the decision making was that there was a desire to try to make use of the apples rather than wasting them. So, and they also identified that if they just sent them all into a landfill and then covered them, they would produce methane gas, and that's bad for the environment. So that was not something that they wanted to do either. When we look at identifying what is important, you might be surprised at what's ultimately really important to some of your affected parties. And that's why it's so important that we get that diverse viewpoint. Then our next step. This is brainstorming without judgment, which is the hardest part of the brainstorming process. All options are on the table. There's no stupid ideas. There's no practicalities. If you tell me that you want to pick up, 85,000 tons of apples and shoot them into the sun using a space barge, I will write that on the sheet. That is fine at this stage. There are a lot of ways to solve complex problems, and the more ideas that we can get out without the filter, the more likely it is that we're going to be able to hit on some that actually are great. Sometimes what happens when we brainstorm and judge at the same time is people will not feel safe putting forward ideas that actually were really good ideas. So the psychological safety around the lack of judgment and without practicalities actually is a critical piece of this. We start gathering details. We're also looking to harness the creativity and the knowledge and technical skill of our various group members. Because the reality is often the best proposals often involve pieces from multiple people. So the more involvement we can get, the better our brainstorming is going to be. Once we have as many ideas as we can think of, even if they're absolutely wild, then we start looking for emerging proposals. An emerging proposal is something that you think, wow, which of these ideas is practical? Maybe shooting the apples into the sun isn't very viable. Technologically possible, cost effective. The sun is really far away. We also want to take a look through the process about what proposals the group seemed the most excited about. Were they excited about a few of the options? We start to narrow down based on practicality. We want to also now look at needs versus wants. Are there some of these that don't meet the needs or aren't going to ultimately reduce risk? Often when we think about end goal, especially in safety, risk reduction is one of the end goals. And if you look at your proposals and you say, that's not actually going to reduce the risk, maybe at all, that's maybe not something that we want to consider. Or maybe it would only reduce the risk when used in conjunction with something else on the list. Maybe we're starting to get pieces of a multi-partite, multi-phase proposal coming forward. We also want to really think about core needs versus preferences, filter through that, and figure out what our pros and cons are, as well as what our constraints might be. Constraints in the real world could be cost, they could be time, they could be logistical. When we think about during the pandemic in particular, there was a lot of supply chain shortages. So there were constraints in organizations in terms of even determining what the path forward might be based on what they can get. Figure out what your constraints are, figure out what's practical. And we want to consider pros and cons because every one of these options is going to have pros and cons. And we want to look at what those might be, because that also allows us to be able to put a proposal together where we can maybe have multiple options, where a pro of one is going to kind of address a con of another. We also want to, especially in the safety world, think about the hierarchy of controls. We always want to start at the top. Can we eliminate? In the case of Apple Valley, cutting down all the apple trees actually isn't a good idea for some really valuable reasons. We could consider maybe an element of eliminate where we cut down high risk apple trees or apple trees that are old or diseased or that actually really do need to go because they're planted in a bad location or they're creating other problems. But it's not going to solve the big problem just with a little bit of forestry. We want as much as possible to choose controls that don't rely on human compliance because we know that human behavior is not always perfect. We also want to consider what is predictable. If you make doing it the easy way, the fastest and safest way, they're going to do it right every single time. But if the safe way is the hardest, most cumbersome, and most time consuming, what do you think people are going to pick? When they're by themselves, they're probably going to do it the fast, easy, unsafe way. So the more nuance that we can consider, the better. We want to consider building in redundancy as well. So rather than just putting one type of control in place, we put multiple types of control in place so we can address strengths and weaknesses of our various options. As we can continue on our consensus building process, we then address concerns. We want to give space for differing viewpoints. This is a particular point in the process where we really need to go around the table, at the very least one by one, to give people the opportunity to dissent. We want to ensure that participants' unique experiences have been considered. We want to lean into constructive conflict. It is a positive. Often we think of conflict as something we want to avoid, but it's in the conflict, well done in an appropriate, constructive, and positive way, that we lead to our best outcomes. Oftentimes, when we're barreling forward toward building a determination of a path forward, we forget to stop and create that space for people to say, I think this project is actually a really bad idea. We also want to, as individuals, keep an open mind to the concerns of others. One of the interesting things about conflict is around psychological safety. People tend to have higher levels of constructive and positive conflict where they feel psychologically safe. And where people are saying, hey, I think this maybe is not going to work as well as we think, this is actually a positive. It shows that they feel safe to do that. If you're looking around at a table and everyone is sitting there silently, that shows that they're not psychologically safe enough to say, I have concerns. Silence often doesn't mean I'm excited. Usually it means I just don't feel safe saying, I think this is a bad idea. So by ensuring that we are creating that space, I like to call it sacred space for disagreement, we're more likely to be able to get those needs and concerns out in the decision-making process rather than hearing about them in the back end when people are complaining. Once we understand what people's concerns are, and before we leave off on the concerns, hop back quickly to my slide, this is not just about hearing different viewpoints. What do we actually do with this information? We start modifying our proposal. If someone tells you that the uniforms that you're about to buy for them are not going to fit, are we going to find multiple sources for uniforms so people are able to get what they need? Are we going to give people vouchers for tailors? Are we going to ensure that we have that anyone of any gender can buy any uniform off of the catalog that we list? We want to be creative in ensuring that, we talk about these concerns and constructive criticism. When people are expressing their concerns, they're expressing their pain points. In order for them to feel good about the path forward, you need to actually find ways to be able to solve their problems as part of the building process. That's what it takes to build the idea, to build the path forward. Once we have addressed the concerns that were expressed, we are looking to modify, refine, and finalize. We use group feedback to ensure all of those needs are met. We want to, once all of our needs are met, look for ways to maximize preferences. I may want a uniform in a particular color, or I may want one from a fancy designer brand. But I absolutely need something that I can fit over the body I have. And when I bend over, the butt of the uniform doesn't split open, right? When we think about fit, fit is more than just does it, is a size, it's also about a shape. That's really important. Size, color, brand, maybe not. So when we look at preferences, we say, okay, everybody's needs are met. We've made sure that all of these uniforms we're buying, we've got different options that people can choose from. Anybody can choose from different options. And we're going to ensure that we're providing vouchers for tailoring so that people can have, the sleeve shortened to the length that they need. They can have the cuff shortened to the length that they need. They're going to have, we can put darts in so that it's not like baggy in places. Maybe it's going to be a one piece and like I need to put some darts in the back. I'm a little bit hippier on the bottom. Those are all things that we're going to do for people to make sure that we're optimizing their experience. Those are examples of, the hemming, that's kind of important so that I don't trip. The darts in the back, that's an example of optimizing for preferences. So we are looking to maximize the number of really happy people we can have, while also not removing the elements that meet the need for others. And then we develop our details. We get our action steps together. We figure out what our timeframes are going to be. We figure out who's going to be responsible for those various pieces. You may have short, medium, and long-term steps involved with different timeframes, different levels of responsibility. And we're always through this process looking for changes that will make the proposal stronger, more likely to be implemented, easier, and to maximize the outcome. Once we had a good, strong path forward, and in the case of Apple Valley, what did they end up doing? Well, they came up with the idea of an Apple Festival, which sounded like a really good idea because the tourism industry, it had been really good earlier and it had started to drop off, and it was going to bring money into the town. One of the members of the group had a sister who ran a bakery, vegan bakery in the next town over. And it turns out uses lots of applesauce. They identified that there was a really high rate of unemployment. One of the teenagers on the committee said, all of my friends are unemployed. And we've got these seniors who have apple trees in their property. They can't pick up the apples because they're physically unable to. My friends are unemployed. Maybe we could apply to, maybe we could have a program where the teens could pick up the apples and get paid money. And then the town said, actually, that's a really good idea. And then they identified that there was a federal government grant that they could get to create this employment program for youth. So not only did they get the grant money, but the youth were employed. They were then spending more money in the town. They were building relationships with elders. The elders got their apples picked up, so they weren't having bears on their property. Everybody won. A business person, I figured out that actually the apples that were planted were great for cider, so they started a cider distillery. In the festival, they created some apple baking contests to get people using it. They had like cooking with apples demonstrations from famous chefs. They did a lot of different things to try to address the issue. They did cut down some of the apple trees that were diseased or in really dangerous places where the apples were potentially falling over roads or onto vehicles and creating serious slip risk. But they built a process where, with partnerships, they were able to get a partnership for transporting the apples to the next town over into the distillery for low cost. It really helped build everyone around the idea. Rather than getting everyone to eat 10 pounds of apples, they managed to use this to actually build a better town with a better economy, stronger relationships, and they were also able to create this new tourist niche for Apple Valley. So once we have our path forward, once we've determined what we're trying to actually test, how do we actually test for our consensus? This is high five. and it's probably unlike anything you've ever seen before. You can use this with your kids, you can use it with your teens, you can use it with your colleagues, you can use it with your partner. We use our hands. So, how do we use the results of this? First, if consensus is not reached, nobody has lost the consensus process until you stop trying. You go back up to modify the proposal, identify new concerns. This is a great way to identify concerns, even in the end portion of the test. We want to modify our proposal. Maybe we want to try a completely new proposal. Maybe we've made a number of modifications. We just can't seem to get this to meet someone's core needs or a group's core needs. Maybe we need to try something else. Of course, if consensus is reached, we move toward the implementation phase, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So we use our hands. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's the high five method where we have, this is how it gets the name, high five. If I'm putting up 5, all my core needs are met, all my preferences are met, I'm giving enthusiastic, full support to this. I support all aspects of the plan, including all of those details, and where I am now excited to help potentially even lead the implementation. This is someone, if you see a 5, they're like, yeah, this is amazing. This is pretty self-explanatory. What about a 4? You get a 4. These are people that have all of their core needs met. Some of their preferences are met, but they may not be fully enthusiastic. They may have minor concerns about the details. They may not be their ideal solution, but they still think it's pretty darn good. They may have concerns that have been addressed. So maybe they were a 2 before, and then you took their concerns into consideration, and now they're a 4. They in fact did get their needs and some preferences met, so they've moved up the support continuum. They're a good person to help implement rather than maybe lead the implementation, because they still do have some concerns about some of the details. And they are someone who is fundamentally in agreement. 3 fingers. This is where things get interesting. All their core needs are met, but none of their preferences. And if you are using this process, you need to kind of take them through what a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 means. My needs are met, my preferences are absolutely not. I can live with this, but I'm not thrilled. They may believe the proposal is also the best of a set of undesirable options. I sometimes will say, like, if I'm over a barrel and I'm, driving down the 401 and I'm in the middle of nowhere, maybe the best I'm going to be able to come up with for an eating plan is a 3. Because I don't really love any of my options, but it is food. It will meet my need for calories, and I am going to eat it. This is also fascinating because if you're with your friends and you're all like, I'd like to go to this restaurant for brunch. Yeah, we can all do that. And they said, let's test for consensus. You go, how much does everyone want to go to this particular restaurant? And you all get a 3. No one really wants to go to that restaurant. They're just getting fed. Find a different restaurant that people are a little more excited about. 3 fingers might also have a curiosity mindset, the idea that I'm willing to try this out or see how it goes. They may also have voiced concerns. Again, maybe there were 2, now their needs are met, but now their preferences, so they've kind of, again, moved up the continuum. Do not have this person leading the implementation of this if you can at all avoid it. They may also agree in principle, but have disagreements on non-critical details. In contrast with people that are a 2, they may have concerns about critical details. Their core needs are not met, but they could be met if changes are made. These are folks that may also be saying, I am not ready to move forward because I don't have enough information. I feel like we didn't get enough information at the beginning, and I still have questions, or I still feel like we need more research. They may support the overall concept, but actually have major issues with how it's being implemented. So they may say yes to proposal, no to how. And often they will require a modification of the proposal to be able to get a higher level of support. They are expressing concerns that have not yet been addressed. Having conversations with your threes and your twos, absolutely crucial to figure out why. Oh, I see you're a two. That's awesome. I'm so glad that you felt safe telling us that. Tell me more about what your concerns are, and let's talk as a group about how we can ensure those concerns are met. Starting with your concerns that are the most important of your needs. One finger. If you ask your friend who's allergic to all shellfish to go to Red Lobster, they are a one. Okay? Their core needs are not met. You cannot meet their needs. Bringing an EpiPen is not a plan. And the group needs to find either an alternate proposal and go to a different restaurant that doesn't exclusively sell shellfish, or that group member needs to leave. So with one, if the block stems from a fundamental disagreement of the mandate or purpose of the group, the member may choose to leave. Usually one is reserved for irrevocable, irreconcilable, fundamental disagreements. So and again, as we're going through the process, some people, they'll go and they'll say, it's a one. Like, is it really a two? And we could modify this to make you a three. But if somebody's about to end up in the emergency room, yeah, you're a one. These are folks that you're going to need to find a different way to get her done. Abstention. This doesn't mean no support. This means I don't feel comfortable being a part of this decision-making process. Maybe they have really good reasons for this. Always check in with your abstainers. Maybe they're abstaining to hold space for those that are affected. If I'm having a conversation where it's, I'm part of a decision-making that focuses solely on issues that affect people of color, I am a white chick, and maybe I am abstaining because I'm going, you know what? I want to ensure that the people around the table that are in fact affected by this are the ones whose decisions and ideas are the most represented. Maybe you don't have enough information because you're not a technical person. If I'm having a conversation about like the exact design of a guard and you're like, yeah, I represent the office staff on this committee, I really don't know anything about machine guarding. Maybe that's going to be the way you go. Maybe it's long in the future, somebody who's retiring in a couple of months and this isn't going to be implemented for 6 to 10 or 12 months, not going to affect them. They may be a part of the process, but in the end that they decide that they don't want to affect the decision. But it also could be someone who is disengaging from the group. It also could be someone who's very smartly saying, I have a conflict of interest involved. And so in the interest of maintaining impartiality, I will not be a part of the decision process. But wasn't that just voting, Tova? It's not, because it involves nuance. It helps drive discussion. There's no winners or losers. You can very quickly read the temperature of a room, and it helps you identify poor quality proposals. If everyone is a three, your proposal sucks. It also allows you to drive the discussion, because if you have those people that are a two, you have those people that are a three. If you identify it's a one, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board or go back to your list of possible options. If it's a two or a three, can we modify this so that this person is in fact more supportive, getting their core needs met in the case of a two, or getting more of their preferences met in the case of a three? It's different than voting because it allows you to build around the discussion. And it's not an endpoint if you didn't reach a consensus. So some tips as we close off to build consensus. Be open and honest about the reasons for your viewpoints. Actively listen, be respectful, be trusting, be deeply honest with yourself about what you really need versus what you want. Be flexible about your own preferences to ensure that other people's needs are met. I'm going to let go of a preference if it means someone else's core need is in fact being satisfied. We want to participate, think creatively, ensure that our facilitator stays neutral, and work towards what's best for everyone, not just what's best for you. We're building relationships as we go. We're building trust. We're getting to know each other. Be willing to celebrate and value differences between people, and we want to give sufficient time. And that's the end of our session. Thank you so much for joining us for this fantastic health and safety connection. If you have questions about consensus or any safety topic, I can be reached at tova.larson@wsps.ca. As we tail off our session today, I am still here for questions. It is 12 o'clock, so you are able to head off into the wild yonder. We do have some fabulous consulting services, including some complimentary consulting. If you want to learn more about having a no-cost compliance assessment tool performed for your workplace, we can help you with that. If you're interested in a no-cost to you material handling assessment, we can send a consultant out to do that. If you have questions about or are looking for resources, we have, of course, training, but we also have the Health and Safety Excellence Program. That is a WSIB program that can get you some money back for building safety programs you should have anyway. Again, I'm here for questions. If you do have questions about the consensus process, this was recorded if you want to share it with a friend. The recording will be, it does take some time for them to be available. I hope you had a fantastic session. Stay safe and have fun. And, oh, you're so welcome. I'll be seeing you tomorrow. I think if you're in my certification program, then I will be seeing you tomorrow. Awesome. Oh, you're so welcome. And for those of you that are still left, I'm also dying to know what your favorite takeaway was. If you had a particular takeaway that you thought, wow, I'm really glad that I attended because this was something that I learned that was new. Everything. You covered a lot. I did. Yeah, there's a lot of ground to cover, and it's very different. When people say, when they think about consensus, often they don't necessarily understand what it is at the very beginning. And then once they see what the process can look like, they go, wow, that's really different than what I thought it would be. Oh, you're so welcome. Raising the hands. Yeah, I'll be really honest. I did not create that. I actually borrowed it from some folks that were making, it was some folks that were in a complex relationship situation with multiple adults involved, who were making decisions about COVID risk. And it was something that was honest. It was actually, I heard it on CBC. And when I heard about it, I thought that is the smartest thing I have heard probably on a radio station ever. And it's something that it was groundbreaking. Like if you've ever had one of those times where you kind of want to pull your car over, because I was driving at the time when I heard it, like I remember where I was. That's how impactful this was on my thinking about decision making. And it's something that you can use whether the group is large or small. It's great to use with children as well. If you're giving them choices, to be able to say, like even for something like dinner, you're like, how are you feeling about pizza and spaghetti? And they're like, 3. Like, how are you feeling about making our own homemade pizzas together? I'm like, 5. You're going to get a sense of what they want, right? I think it's great. You're so welcome. Ah, I'm so glad, Ryan. Yeah, it certainly came from a labor of love, and it really started actually with my experiences with a lot of organizations that were struggling. It's in the federal sector. This is mandated to build a consensus, but then they don't really tell you much about exactly how to do it. And so the rest of this, I was able to build around. So welcome. All right. Any last takeaways? Anything that you're like, wow, that was totally different. This was not the session I was picturing, especially from a safety standpoint. Going once, going twice on great takeaways. All right. It is 12:05. Have a great lunch, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, have fun, and we'll see you back. Hopefully, for those of you that are still here, we have managing young workers. Oh, certification starts at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. But if you can come into the room at 8 a.m., we can do your ID check. Then you can go grab another cup of coffee. Just a heads up for those of you that are still here. Next Monday, same bat time, same bat place. 4:30, by the way. It was 8:30 to 4:30 all 3 days. The program does. The ID check we only have to do once. So upcoming safety connections. Next Monday, same bat time, same bat place. We have managing young workers, where we're going to talk all about adolescent brains, not just teenagers, but also young adults, about how they're about physiologic differences in their brain and how that impacts decision making. We're also going to talk about considerations for workplaces in exactly what the research shows actually does reduce risk for young workers, and how supervisors can put these strategies into action. I think I've been developing the deck for that. I think we're at close to 100 takeaways so far that of like little tidbits that supervisors can in fact implement to reduce risk and also to manage some of the challenges and concerns that happen when you're managing young people. I will see you, Lisa, next Monday. All right, have a great day. Stay safe, have fun. Bye, everyone.